Jungkook adjusted his backpack as he walked into the massive lecture hall, his steps faltering as he saw the rows of students already seated. His first day at university was supposed to be exciting, but the whispers around him made him anxious. "Have you seen him yet?" someone behind Jungkook whispered. "Professor Kim Taehyung? I heard he's terrifyingly strict." "Yeah, but apparently, he's insanely good-looking too," another voice chimed in. Jungkook rolled his eyes, thinking it was probably an exaggeration. Settling into a seat near the middle, he pulled out his notebook, his mind more focused on surviving the semester than entertaining gossip. The chatter in the room ceased as a tall, broad-shouldered man entered the hall. Professor Kim Taehyung was unlike anyone Jungkook had expected. His sharp suit fit perfectly, exuding authority, and the slight adjustment of his glasses was the only sign of movement as his piercing eyes scanned the room. "Good morning," Taehyung began, his deep voice echoing in the silent hall. "This is advanced literature. If you're not here to work hard, I suggest you leave now." Jungkook blinked, his breath caught. The man's tone was icy, his demeanor unyielding, but something about him drew Jungkook's attention. He looked down at his notebook, pretending to write, but his thoughts were entirely elsewhere. "He's dangerous," Jungkook thought, biting his lip as his heart beat faster. And when like it, weeks passed, and Jungkook found himself more captivated by Professor Kim than any of his lectures. It started innocently enough, admiring the way Taehyung spoke with authority, the sharp intelligence in his eyes. But soon, it turned into something more. Jungkook stayed behind after class one day, his excuse a vague question about an upcoming assignment. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "The assignment instructions were clear, Mr. Jian," Taehyung said, his tone flat. "What exactly are you confused about?" Jungkook scratched the back of his neck, feigning innocence. "I just wanted to make sure I was on the right track," Taehyung sighed, stepping closer to glance at Jungkook's notes. The proximity made Jungkook's pulse quicken. He couldn't help but notice the faint cologne Taehyung wore, the way his fingers tapped the desk as he explained. "Pay attention," Taehyung said sharply, snapping Jungkook out of his daze. "You won't get any special treatment just because you linger after class," Jungkook smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Who said I wanted special treatments?" Professor Taehyung's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he walked away, leaving Jungkook grinning to himself. "He's so fun to mess with," Jungkook thought, already planning his next move. Jungkook's antics escalated. He made subtle comments during lectures, his tone laced with double meanings. He purposely sat in the front row, letting his gaze linger on Taehyung just a second too long. One evening, after submitting his paper late, Jungkook found himself in Taehyung's office. The air was heavy with tension as Taehyung leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "You've been testing my patience, Jungkook," Taehyung said, his voice low but firm. Jungkook leaned against the door frame, feigning nonchalance. "I don't know what you mean, Professor." Taehyung's eyes narrowed, his gaze intense. "You know exactly what I mean. Your behavior in class has been inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" Jungkook echoed, stepping closer. "Or are you just uncomfortable because I see through you?" Taehyung's expression darkened, but he didn't move away as Jungkook closed the gap between them. "Careful, Jungkook," Taehyung warned, his voice dropping. "You're playing with fire," Jungkook smirked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I like getting burned," The room was silent, the tension thick. Taehyung stared at him, his jaw clenched, as if fighting an internal battle. Finally, he turned away, his voice cold. Leave. Now. Jungkook hesitated but obeyed, a smirk still tugging at his lips. He wasn't done yet. Jungkook couldn't stop thinking about the tension that filled Professor Kim's office. His heart raced at the memory of the older man's sharp gaze and his deep, steady voice warning him to back off. But instead of scaring Jungkook, it only fueled his curiosity and his determination. The next day, Jungkook walked into class with his usual smirk, catching Taehyung's cold, calculating eyes as he entered. Their silent exchange sent a thrill down Jungkook's spine. As Taehyung lectured, his voice a commanding presence in the room, Jungkook found himself scribbling absent-mindedly. The words were irrelevant, his thoughts were on Taehyung. Jian Jungkook. Jungkook's head snapped up at the sound of his name. Taehyung stood at the front, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in a challenging arch. Would you care to share your insights with the class? A few students chuckled, but Jungkook simply leaned back in his chair, a cocky grin on his lips. I think your explanation was perfect, Professor. No need for me to add anything. Taehyung's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing, turning back to the board. Jungkook's grin widened. Later that evening, Jungkook stayed behind once again, pretending to review notes as the classroom emptied. Taehyung glanced at him, clearly annoyed but resigned. Do you ever go home? Jian asked, his tone as cold as ever. Jungkook shrugged, his smile playful. Not when I can get extra help from my favorite professor. Taehyung slammed his book shut, the sharp sound echoing in the empty room. Cut the act, Jungkook. What do you really want? Jungkook leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His gaze was bold, his voice softer but no less daring. What if I said I wanted you? Professor Taehyung's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed himself. This is inappropriate, he said firmly, though his voice wavered just enough for Jungkook to notice. Inappropriate doesn't mean impossible, Jungkook countered, standing up and walking toward him. He stopped just a foot away, his eyes never leaving Taehyung's. You think this is a game? Taehyung said, his voice low and dangerous. Maybe, Jungkook admitted, his smirk returning. Or maybe it's something more. Before Taehyung could respond, the tension snapped like a taut string. He stepped forward, his face inches from Jungkook's. His hands gripped the edge of the desk beside them, his voice a harsh whisper. Leave. Now. Before you regret this. Jungkook's heart pounded, but he didn't move. What if I'm not afraid of regrets? Taehyung stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jungkook alone in the empty classroom. Jungkook exhaled, his smirk fading into something softer. For the first time, he wondered if he'd crossed a line he wasn't ready for. The following week, Taehyung's demeanor grew colder, if that was even possible. He avoided Jungkook's gaze during lectures, his tone sharper than usual whenever he addressed him. But instead of discouraging Jungkook, it only made him more determined. Jungkook lingered after class again, watching as Taehyung packed his things. The air between them was heavy, a silent warning that seemed willing to lose. Professor, Jungkook called, his voice softer than usual. Taehyung paused but didn't look up. What is it this time? Jungkook hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. I wanted to apologize, If I crossed a line, that caught Taehyung's attention. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Apologizing now, are we? What brought on this sudden burst of self-awareness? Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, avoiding Taehyung's piercing gaze. I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable. I guess I wanted your attention. Taehyung's lips twitched, almost forming a smirk, but he quickly masked it. You've had my attention since the first day, Jungkook. That doesn't mean I'll tolerate your behavior. Jungkook's head snapped up, his heart skipping a beat. I have your attention. Taehyung's expression hardened. Don't read into it. I'm your professor, nothing more. Jungkook stepped closer, his voice dropping. What if I want more? Taehyung's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Stop this, Jungkook. You don't know what you're doing. Then tell me, Jungkook challenged, his voice trembling slightly. Because I can't stop thinking about you. The room fell silent. Taehyung stared at Jungkook, his cold mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of something deeper, something he was trying desperately to hide. Leave, Taehyung said finally, his voice softer this time. Before we both do something we regret. Jungkook hesitated, but the vulnerability in Taehyung's eyes made him step back. This isn't over, he said quietly, turning and walking away. Days later, Jungkook found himself in the library late at night, trying to focus on his studies. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Taehyung, the way his voice grew softer when he told him to leave, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long. Lost in thought, Jungkook didn't notice someone approaching until a shadow fell over his desk. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat as Taehyung stood there, his expression unreadable. Professor, Jungkook asked, surprised. I couldn't sleep, Taehyung admitted, his voice low. And I thought I might find you here. Jungkook's cheeks flushed, but he quickly recovered. Couldn't stay away, Taehyung sighed, sitting down across from him. You're relentless, Jungkook. Do you even understand the consequences of what you're doing? Jungkook leaned forward, his gaze steady. I understand that I want you. And I think you want me too. Taehyung didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Jungkook, as if trying to decide whether to push him away or pull him closer. Say something, Jungkook whispered, his voice breaking the silence. Taehyung's expression softened just enough for Jungkook to see the struggle behind his cold exterior. You're reckless, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Jungkook smiled faintly, leaning closer. And you're scared, Taehyung didn't deny it. Instead, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Go home, Jungkook, he said, his tone firm. This ends here. But as he walked away, Jungkook knew it was far from over. The tension between Taehyung and Jungkook became unbearable. Every glance, every word exchanged was laced with something neither dared to name but both felt deeply. Taehyung's cold demeanor began to crack, and Jungkook, persistent as ever, refused to back down. It was a stormy evening when everything came to a head. Rain poured relentlessly, and the university halls were nearly empty. Jungkook waited outside Taehyung's office, his heart pounding as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. When the door finally opened, Taehyung froze at the sight of Jungkook, his usual mask of indifference faltering for a split second. Jungkook, I thought I told you. Enough, Jungkook interrupted, his voice trembling but determined. I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth, Taehyung sighed, stepping aside to let him in. Once inside, He closed the door, leaning against it as he crossed his arms. What truth, Jungkook? That you're a reckless student playing a dangerous game. Jungkook took a step closer, his eyes locked on Taehyung's. That you feel this too? Taehyung's breath hitched, but he quickly recovered, shaking his head. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Jungkook whispered, closing the distance between them. I've seen the way you look at me. The way you hesitate every time you tell me to leave. Taehyung stared at him, his walls crumbling under Jungkook's relentless gaze. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, unsure. You're my student, Taehyung said, his voice breaking. And you're my professor, Jungkook replied softly. But that doesn't change how I feel. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if something inside him finally snapped, Taehyung closed the gap between them, his lips crashing onto Jungkook's. The desperate, filled with all the tension they'd been holding back for weeks. Jungkook's hands gripped Taehyung's shoulders, pulling him closer, while Taehyung's fingers tangled in Jungkook's hair, his control slipping completely. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads pressed together. This is a mistake, Taehyung whispered, his voice shaking. Then let's make it worth it, Jungkook said, his lips curving into a soft smile. Taehyung stared at him, 1,000 emotions flickering in his eyes. Finally, he sighed, his lips brushing against Jungkook's once more. Reckless, he murmured against Jungkook's mouth. And you love it, Jungkook teased, pulling him back in. For once, Taehyung didn't argue. Months later, the relationship between the cold professor and his perverted student was their secret, hidden behind closed doors and stolen moments. Taehyung still scolded Jungkook during lectures, and Jungkook still teased him relentlessly. But behind the icy glares and mischievous grins were smiles only they understood. Because sometimes, crossing lines led to something extraordinary. The storm outside Taehyung's office mirrored the tension between him and Jungkook. Rain pounded against the windows, but inside, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Jungkook stood by the door, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something softer, more earnest. I'm tired of pretending, Professor, he said, his voice steady. I know you feel this too, Taehyung sighed, running a hand through his hair. Jungkook, this isn't just about feelings. There are boundaries, lines we shouldn't cross. Jungkook stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. But we've already crossed them. You've let me see a side of you no one else sees. And I can't walk away from that. Taehyung clenched his fists, his usual composure slipping. Do you even understand the risks? What happens if someone finds out I don't care about the risks? Jungkook replied. I care about you. The raw sincerity in Jungkook's voice broke through Taehyung's defenses. For the first time, the cold, reserved professor allowed himself to feel. He stepped closer, his hands trembling slightly as he cupped Jungkook's face. This isn't just a game to you, is it? Taehyung asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It never was, Jungkook answered, leaning into Taehyung's touch. And just like that, the wall Taehyung had built around himself crumbled. He pulled Jungkook into a gentle at first but deepening as their emotions took over. Jungkook's arms wrapped around Taehyung's neck, pulling him closer as if to say, I'm not letting go. Jungkook, Taehyung murmured, his voice filled with both hesitation and relief. Taehyung, Jungkook corrected with a soft smile. From that stormy night, Their relationship shifted into something neither had expected but both cherished. In class, Taehyung remained the disciplined professor, and Jungkook, the diligent yet cheeky student. But in the quiet moments, away from prying eyes, they found solace in each other. They learned to navigate their unique bond carefully, aware of the world around them but unwilling to let it dictate their feelings. For Taehyung, Jungkook became the spark that thawed his guarded heart. And for Jungkook, Taehyung was the anchor he didn't know he needed. Their journey was far from easy, but together, they found a way to rewrite the rules, proving that sometimes, taking a chance on the unexpected could lead to something extraordinary.